So for this week on CyberSchool, we're talking about something that we've covered in the past, and we've covered a lot with our outdoor units. We've definitely mentioned it a lot, and it's something that we wanted to do a specific CyberSchool focusing on, and that is what the heck an IP rating is and how you should preserve it. You know, when you're putting these expensive devices out in the wild, out in, sometimes in the wilderness, but sometimes just on the exterior of your building, you want to take the extra precautions when you're installing these things to make sure that, that fancy, a couple $100 intercom or that, couple $100 horn you're mounting up there to page in your parking lot will last out there for a couple years and not, maybe just a year or two and it stops working and you got to get a scissor lift to take it down. I've heard plenty of horror stories from people installing things and them not working and them being a real hassle to get the unit down so that way they can, take a peek at it and realize it's full of water. So hopefully after watching this video, you'll understand a little bit more about what IP rating is and the steps that can be taken to preserve that rating so the hardware will last as long as it should. So with that, what is an IP rating? IP rating stands for ingress protection, and that's basically what ingress means is things getting inside that you might not want to get inside. And the typical format for an IP rating is an IP, and then the letters IP again for ingress protection, and then there will be two numbers. The two numbers stand for X for solids, which is just our first number there, and then Y, our second number, is for liquids. So that way, with the IP rating, you know how good a particular device or piece of equipment, it doesn't necessarily have to be a device. A lot of the times you'll see IP ratings and things that, wouldn't typically be considered a device. Things like, say, for example, where you keep all of the controllers and the switching mechanisms for your outdoor sprinkler system are probably located in an IP-rated box of some sort. It doesn't necessarily have to protect a device. However, that's typically how it does end up being used. And for our discussion today, the IP rating is for protecting electrical equipment. So the ratings are, of course, for solids 1 through 6. And for liquids, 1 through 6 just wasn't enough, so they stepped it up to 1 through 8. So basically, the worst capability would be 0, for no rating at all, or IP68 for the highest possible protection. So here's a nice chart that kind of goes over and gives you an idea of like, okay, so what the heck is the difference between a 1 and a 6? Well, a 1 as an example for solid protection is basically something that has the right protection, so you basically can't stick your hand in it. It didn't necessarily start IP rating as a way to, say, protect from really fine dust particles. It can start at the highest level IP rating of level 1, which means you can't stick your hand in it, or IP rating of 2, where you can't stick your finger in it, and then so on and so forth. It gets progressively smaller. Of course, again, an IP rating of 0 means no protection, and an IP rating of 68 means the best possible protection. And all of these numbers are well and good. Okay, IP68 rating is the best. Well, give me some comparisons. Give me some like everyday stuff that you might run into out there in the wild and just out there in your everyday, so that way you can kind of understand and quantify things. So for example, an electrical socket, the same thing that you probably plug in your computer to, you plug in your phone charger, what have you, at least the ones in the walls are typically rated IP22, which means if we go to our chart here, a 2 rating for solid means you can't stick a finger in a socket. As much as I tried, as a little kid trying to stick my finger in sockets, it never worked. My finger was just never small enough. And then a water rating of 2 means that water that is just falling vertically down will not go inside the enclosure as long as it's not tilted, say, 15 degrees in one direction. So basically, vertical flowing water can't get into it. So that's a good idea and kind of helps you quantify what an electrical socket is rated to, because it's something, again, we encounter all across the world. Everybody's dealt with this kind of a socket, so it gives you an idea. Okay, a 22 is an electrical socket. I kind of understand that. Of course, there's lots of other legislation and stuff that goes into sockets, stuff like you have to have in bathrooms like the anti-shock stuff. There's a whole bunch of regulations that go into electrical sockets. Really not what we're talking about today, but they just kind of give a good example. Another good example of the highest range would be things like, smartphones that you can get today. I'm not sure if the new iPhone 11 or the iPhone X, I'm not an iPhone guy, so I don't know, but I know the Samsung Galaxy S20 is IP68 rating. And 68 rating, since we know that is the highest level, what does that mean? Well, that means if we take our number 6, that means that it is known as a dust-tight enclosure without the ingress of dust. So that means no matter what happens when that thing is sealed, no dust is getting in there, and it has a time for about 2 to 8 hours of when you can expect that. But typically when something is rated at IP level 6, basically dust is not going to get in there. Theoretically possible, and this does not mean, it's impervious to dust, but typically no dust is going to be getting in there. Oh, I have a comment. Thank you, thank you. Yes, so the iPhones, for our iPhone users out there, iPhone 12, 12 mini, 12 Pro, and 12 Pro Max all have an IP68 rating. Wonderful. So good to know that even those Apple users out there do have that IP68 rating. So now that we've kind of covered what the dust rating means, what does the 8 rating mean in terms of water resistance? So 8 rating, according to our chart here, means that it has protection against the effects of immersion in water under pressure for long periods. And that's not particularly well defined, but typically that means that it is submersion rated. So, you'll see sometimes, people go and take underwater videos with their iPhone or their Samsung Galaxy. And that's possible with that type of a rating. So this kind of gives you an idea to understand the difference between, say, kind of a lower protection rating and a higher protection rating. Thankfully, when you're dealing with a lot of CyberData devices, you're either dealing with an IP65 or an IP66 rating. So you know that you're dealing with a fairly good, product in terms of dealing with the weather, solids, that type of stuff. Of course, we don't really have anything yet that you could go and, bury in water, but, it's pretty good protection for most of the applications of our products. So now that we understand a little bit more about IP rating, let's throw some letters into the mix because, of course, nothing is just as simple as 2 numbers and that's it. A lot of the times when you're dealing with these types of ratings, they have to go and evolve it as people go and try to introduce other types of fluids or other things as you're dealing with a particular rating. So that's where letters will come in, because things like oil or high voltage don't necessarily fall into, okay, so my thing is dustproof and it's waterproof, but how does it handle electricity? That's not even covered with an IP rating. Not really designed to deal with an IP rating, but that's where a lot of these letters come in. So things like oil resistance, if a device is oil resistant and has passed that in the IP rating test, it'll be whatever the IP rating is, say IP68, and it'll have an F appended to it, which means it's also oil resistant. Then you'll get other things that kind of demonstrate what the device was doing during that particular test. And that's with letters like M or S. And it's very simple, where M for moving. So you know that during the portion of the water test, the device was moving. So that could be, say, something like an underwater camera that would typically be moving when you're using it. Whereas, say, an S would be stagnant. So an S is not moving during that particular water test. So you'll see a lot more letters appear with these IP ratings, and they're becoming a little bit more common. But another type of rating that kind of expanded on the regular IP68 rating is how does equipment handle steam and high pressure water and things like that. And that's where typically steam protection wouldn't be covered in an IP rating because, of course, it's dealing with liquid water, not gaseous water. So that's where the IP9K rating comes from. And that means that it's protected against a high pressure, high temperature steam blast from multiple angles, where they can actually get in there and literally spray the thing down with, say, like, a shark cleaner that you would clean your floors with, probably, higher grade than something like that. But, basically the highest tier that you can go now is IP whatever your dust protection rating is, 9K. So when we're dealing with this water protection or water ingress, you'll hear a lot of different terms thrown around. Things like water resistant, water repellent, and waterproof. What does this actually mean? Like, okay, my thing is IP68 rated, but it says it's water repellent and it doesn't say it's waterproof. Shouldn't it be waterproof? What do all these things mean? And water resistance is kind of the lowest level protection that different marketers will throw out when they're saying that it has a certain level of water protection. So what water resistance means, it makes the way that the device or that piece of equipment was built, it makes that water ingress, that influx of water, difficult but not impossible. So key examples of that are things like some of the first smartwatches that you could get. I know most Fitbits and stuff like that now are, IP68 rated, so you wouldn't call them water resistant, but some of the early ones were water resistant. So, they were basically safe to like wash your hands with, or, you might get splashed with them. You wouldn't want to go swimming or take a shower with them, but they're typically water resistant. So, getting a little bit of water on it isn't going to kill it, but don't go submerge that thing. Don't go run it through your dishwasher to try to clean it. Then the next step up from there is water repellent. Water repellent kind of fits in here, but it kind of doesn't, because it acts completely different to say something that's water resistant or waterproof. So when something is water repellent, it's actually coated with this thing called a hydrophobic material. And basically, I'm sure a lot of people have seen this. This is really common with a lot of textures and stuff that they'll do on cars, especially really fancy cars, where they don't want water sitting on a car, so that way it can pool in an area, potentially mess up the paint or even rust it. They'll put in a hydrophobic material in there, so the water actually can't collect on there. The water is basically rejected by this hydrophobic material, and it beads up on there, and it can't actually stick to whatever material. So it's been very common with a lot of outdoor shoes and hiking boots, where they'll show it as a gimmick, or even some tennis shoes now, where they'll go and take a big old gallon of water and just pour it all over their shoe, where they've got their cell phone or some expensive paperwork or something inside the shoe, and it comes out dry. And that's because of that water repellent coating that they put on there that actually repels the water because of the coating on there. It's hydrophobic, meaning water doesn't like it, water's afraid of it, water meaning hydro, and phobic meaning scared. It's scared of water, so the water gets scared away and basically stays off it. It doesn't really fit in, say, water resistant, where water resistance is built into the device, so that way by design it kind of keeps the water out, whereas water repellent is basically coated with something to keep the water out. But then you get into waterproof, and this is a big kind of marketing buzzword that a lot of different companies will come out and say, oh, it's waterproof, but it's only IP66 rated. It's not actually waterproof. That's because there's no particular industry standard when you're dealing with, say, a waterproof rating. It's basically a marketing word. If you want to know if something's actually waterproof, you want that IP rating. And if you're trying to look at a device, or say some piece of outdoor camping gear that says it's waterproof, but they don't give you that that IP68 rating or an IP rating at all, might not be something to go for. It might just be those marketing buzzwords. But a key thing to know when you're dealing with something that's waterproof is that doesn't mean that it's impervious to water, meaning that, okay, this thing is, it's waterproof. I don't need to worry about anything. I'm going to strap it to a submarine and take it down into the bottom of the ocean. Just because it says it's waterproof doesn't mean that it's actually waterproof, and it doesn't mean that it's actually impervious to water. Key examples of that are some other outdoor and camping gear that you can get. Things like dry bags for camping gear that you'll actually roll down and strap. That are more waterproof. You can actually submerge those things in a river, and that your stuff's not going to get wet. Definitely use those camping as a kid. But these are the different kinds of water kind of buzzwords that you'll hear about that kind of coincide with IP rating. Not as much as you would typically expect, but when you're dealing with any type of waterproof and you want to know, okay, is this thing actually waterproof or is it just water resistant? Go for that IP rating, because that IP rating is something that's tested, it's a standard, and if something is IP68 rated, that thing is fine to go and take in a swimming pool. So just kind of these things help you decide as you're looking towards making that particular device purchase. So as we build on through IP rating, sometimes you need to go even further beyond, and that's where NEMA comes in. NEMA rating basically built on that IP rating and considers corrosive elements. So when they designed all of the tests for IP rating, they basically just dealt with water. But a lot of the times, places aren't just dealing with water. They might be dealing with, say, heavy water, or even just other corrosive materials or oil and times like that. It could be, say, an auto body shop that, they've got, yeah, okay, they've got a, wash station where they, make the little car attendant Parker guys go and wash customers' cars before they pick them up. But, a lot of the times they're dealing with motor oil or transmission fluid and stuff like that, stuff that might be corrosive. So IP rating doesn't really cover stuff like that. So that's where the NEMA rating comes in. It's further beyond that regular IP-based rating. And this one goes through 1 through 13. And thankfully, we're not dealing with, like multiple digits and stuff like that. It's a lot easier to think of 1, less protection, 13, more protection. And that also involves different things like falling material. And again, this falling material doesn't necessarily need to be like, oh, there's a rock falling and it's going to break it. It does kind of cover that, but it's also potentially, say, like falling dust, or places that they'll really use a lot of NEMA rating is places like where they're dealing with potentially explosive materials. So things like where they produce flour. Really surprising to find out that flour is actually extremely flammable, like regular baking flour, or things like cocoa powder. Or even like hot chocolate mix. Boy, I have some fun stories about being a kid, going to camporee as a Boy Scout and playing with hot chocolate powder. You can really start some fires with that stuff. But NEMA rating 1 is basically just protection against impact and falling material, and it goes all the way up to NEMA rating 813, which is protection from hazardous parts of the equipment. So all the hazardous parts of the equipment, things like any moving parts or things that really could get damaged, are even more secured in that particular enclosure. And it protects all the way against dirt, dust, lint, fibers, sprays, splash, and seepage of water and oil. So seepage is a thing that we'll cover a lot as we move into protecting your IP rating, but all of those things are considered when you're dealing with a NEMA rating, and that's kind of the step beyond the IP rating because things can always be improved on. So now that we kind of understand, okay, we get what IP rating is, we get what NEMA rating is, what does this have to do with CyberData? Well, when you're dealing with CyberData equipment, we've typically got 2 categories that products will fall into: your IP65 rated and your IP66 rated. We do have some other products that'll come out that are in different groups, but for today's video, we're just strictly talking about IP65 and IP66. Some key examples of products that are going to be IP65 rated are outdoor intercoms. And these are IP65 rated because that's typically good enough for the locations that they're going to be put into. Typically, where you'll see intercoms are, say, on the exterior of a building that may or might not be in a covered area, or say on a pole, so that way somebody can open the gate to go park. Typically, these devices are a little bit more protected, so IP65 rating is sufficient. And we know that IP65 rating basically means that they're splash resistant and they are protected against as they term it in the actual definition, it's protected against a jet of water. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a high-pressure jet of water, but it's a jet of water. So IP65 rated is basically fine to go outside. All the different outdoor rated intercoms, so things like our outdoor intercom with a keypad, and then our video intercom variants, as well as our RFID intercom variants, are all going to be IP65 rated. And we step it up a little bit more with products that might not have the nice cover that, say, those intercoms do. Your intercoms at your front door, people are going to be going through that door, so you might have an awning up above. Well, that IP66 horn that's making announcements to your parking lot is probably going to be mounted onto one of your light poles, so that thing isn't going to get any protection. Heck, I mean, birds might even land on it, might even have a little bit of bird duty on there. You never know. But that's where IP66 rating comes in, and that's where things that will be better protected out there in the elements. And of these 2 products, we sell a ton of these. The IP66 is anybody that's been watching a lot of CyberSchool knows that I love the IP66 horn. It's my favorite product for outdoor paging, indoor paging, basically any paging where you don't need a speaker. The horn is the right way to go because it's easy to mount. It's got great protection, but that's a really key example of one of our IP66 rated units. And a big selling point for this, whether it's going to be indoor or outdoor, is that it's IP66 rated, and that 6 instead of the 5 means that it's protected against powerful jets of water. And one of the fun things that we got to do for some of the interns at CyberData is when we came up with this product, we had to go and verify that IP rating test to make sure that the company that handled the rating actually did it good. And, that's what you have interns for. They get to go stand outside and stand in a kiddie pool and spray stuff with a hose until the engineers are satisfied with it. So that's what we made some of our interns do. Don't you love interns? But it's a really cool product, and it's great with that IP66 rating to go in any environment, because with that IP66 rating, to clean it, you don't necessarily have to take it down and, be careful and wipe it down. You don't spray anything into it. You can literally spray the thing down with a hose to be able to clean it. Of course, it is your equipment. You do with it as you wish. That is not an official CyberData statement to spray things down and clean it. We don't recommend that, but you can because of the IP66 rating. And things also like the loudspeaker amplifier have a really nice NEMA-rated IP66 enclosure. So whether you're going for a paging option or one of our intercom options, the stuff that you're going to be putting outside has a good level of protection, whether it's going to be IP65 or IP66 rating. So now that we know what the actual ratings are that the CyberData devices have, what does this properly mean in terms of protection? So that IP6, and this goes for both. So our first letter going for our dust protection, again noted here as blue. Since they're dust tight, it means no ingress of dust. So it's really cool to see with, say, our loudspeaker amplifier, when that thing is mounted and closed and sealed up, no dust is getting in there, period. So, customers can have installs of these things that are years old, or say even our trade show display that, gets used maybe a couple times a year. You'd expect, okay, that thing really doesn't get touched too much. There's going to be dust in it. Well, there's dust on it, but inside, no, there's no dust because it's IP65. It's IP6 rated in terms of dust. So it makes for a really strong protection. And then for the IP65 rating, so that means, again, that it's protected against jets of water, which means that when these two are combined, it means that it's dust tight and it's protected from jets of water. And that is, of course, jets is defined by a certain pressure per minute. Really not important for the context of this video, whether we're dealing with flow rates and stuff. This is a super basic kind of explanation of what all this means. And then when we're dealing with IP66 rating, that's just a step above there. And of course, we've got the 6 in our first digit, which means that it is dust tight and no ingress of dust. And the second 6 in our water digit means that it is protected from high seas or powerful jets. So basically, that's the same jet that you're dealing with before, but instead of having the hose on at, low pressure, you got that hose cranked up all the way. So it gives you a lot more protection for that unit when you're putting it out there. So it makes these things fine to put in, basically any type of factory, whether they're dealing with flour or water or what have you. These things are going to be fine to put out there. They're not going to get, dusty. At least the outside they will, but the inside will stay nice and clean and thankfully dry. So now that we've kind of covered, what the IP rating means, let's kind of talk about, preserving the IP rating. And when you're preserving an IP rating, you really just basically want to make sure after you're installing it that you're not leaving any points of entry or issues or gaps between that installation service and the particular installation surface, and the device that you're installing. So things like, gaskets or O-rings are kind of a basic thing to kind of deal with. That's the typical thing that you'll think of. You're connecting a hose to a hose bib and your hose leaks a little bit. Well, you forgot to put the O-ring in there, so the thing's going to leak a little bit. And it's that same kind of an ideal. Keeping water in a hose when you're gardening is the same as keeping water out from your expensive electronics. Same type of deal. So things like caulking are also super duper important. We'll cover some great examples of caulking to be able to seal intercoms. You'll deal with caulking a lot more with intercoms as compared to, say, our loudspeaker amplifier or IP66 horn. Caulking is much more important when you're dealing with that, but that just seals any other points of basically mounting for that intercom box to prevent that seepage of water, where that water can come in through screw holes or conduit holes. And things like weather shroud should also be, really considered when you're considering going out and, say, buying one of our video RFID intercoms. You're dropping over a little over $1,000 on one of these things. You might spend that extra $60 on that weather shroud, just to make sure that the water can't pool on the top of our gasket. Our gaskets are great. You'll actually see some great examples of images where our gasket was so good, the entire back body of the intercom, the entire gang box filled with water. Again, a praise to that gasket, but you shouldn't just rely on one potential, thing on there for that protection. If you can go that extra little mile just by spending that little bit of extra money on the weather shroud, can really make a big deal because the water can't pool on that gasket and potentially degrade it over time. It can just run off the metal that's designed to deal with that type of water. But then also install the equipment in a manner and in a way and in a location where water can't pool on or near that device. That can also be another problem that can arise where, say, somebody does all their due diligence when they're installing an IP66 horn, but for some reason, instead of mounting it, down towards the ground where it's paging to, they mount it at kind of an upward angle. So then rain and sleet and snow and what have you can all kind of collect in the inside of that horn and degrade the horn and potentially damage it over time. Again, because that IP66 rating doesn't mean that it's waterproof. It doesn't mean that it doesn't matter. You can just leave it in the water. It's not a pool toy. You shouldn't do that. So let's talk a little bit more about some bad principles when you're installing something. So this is a great example we have. Of course, any long-term CyberData users will know that this is kind of an older gang box that we use, but this is a really good example that we always refer back to when we're talking to different customers and installers about bad things that can happen when you're going and installing an intercom box. And you can see that we've called out a couple different points on this particular install where there are issues. Starting from the top on our image there, we see that they're missing caulking on a couple different points where we've got the screw hole kind of in the upper right-hand corner, noted by the arrow there, and as well as the giant conduit hole where they're routing that big bit of Cat5 or Cat6 cable through. None of that is caulked. So what that means is water could potentially collect on the top surface of the intercom here and run in between the back of the gang box and the front of the wall. And that hole gives a great little entry point for, even just a little bead of water over time to collect in there and run down the back and get on that intercom. So those are two potential points of failure for this potential installation here, where they've got that caulking missing. And you can see for the actual two screws that they use to mount the unit, these two vertical screws above and below our conduit hole here are also not caulked. And while that screw is probably as tight as that thing can get in there, flush up against the gang box and secured into the wall, there's still a possibility for water to get through in the actual threads of that screw and seep through. It's a smaller chance and it's less water that can get through, but it's still that kind of capability. And you could use things like just a bead of caulk over the top of that, or even some sealant on the actual screw, kind of like that Loctite that you'll see on, say, like certain like office chairs and things like that, just to make sure that after that screw goes in, it's a lot harder for it to come out. But while that Loctite and other things that you can put on the screw will prevent that screw from coming out, it also prevents things from coming in on that thread. So things like that is another potential failure point. And then finally, of course, that's not how they installed it. They don't have a nice little red seam of caulk going down the side. They actually don't have any there. So that leaves this entire vertical surface, and the same across the actual top of the intercom and the opposite side, where basically the intercom was just screwed into the wall. There's no caulking to actually create a barrier between the wall and the gang box, so that way water can't get through. So these are a lot of key points that unfortunately we see of failure for intercom installations, where these simple little steps, they didn't spend, literally less than $5 on a tube of caulking to be able to protect this investment. And this led to their intercom being damaged. And since it was an improper installation, unfortunately, our warranty would not cover that. So little bit of time and a few cents on caulking can really go an extra mile and really prevent any potential damage that could happen to that very expensive intercom that would get installed. So this is a key example of what not to do. Here's an example of what you should do. Funny enough, this is actually from one of the intercoms that we had installed at CyberData for a while. This was from one of our video intercoms that we had installed for a good long while. And this shows, of course, a really good install. Going from our top image here, you can see that we went and spent, a little bit of extra time just putting caulking all over any interior surface where water could come in. So you'll see that the 3 top screws that we have, because this different style of gang box, the one that you can currently get now, only has 3 entry points for screws, where you've basically got a triangle pattern that goes around the rear conduit hole. So all of those were sealed completely with some good silicone caulking, and then the actual entry for the rear conduit was actually capped. Of course, we're using some of the same stuff that we used to say cap this lower conduit hole, because I mean it's ours, we've got all this hardware laying around, we might as well use all that stuff we have. You could potentially go this route and do that, but a simple seam of caulk on the inside there, where you just pull the cable through and run the caulk through to completely close up that hole, can totally seal and prevent the issue. And then other small areas, even where we've got our grounding lug right up here, that was also caulked. Just to really do that extra due diligence, just to make sure that any potential point on the interior of the gang box is completely sealed. So that way, when the intercom gets installed, it's basically a sealed environment where nothing can get in, nothing can get out, which means that that intercom board is going to last for years. And there's another option when you're dealing with the actual physical installation. So, of course, not the interior of the gang box, but the exterior. So, of course, really the easiest way to go about sealing the exterior of the gang box to whatever you're sticking it to is a seam of caulk around it, just to make sure that it gets a good seal on the top and the sides and the bottom. But another thing that you can do, and this is becoming a little bit more common with just the availability of this at most hardware stores, is just a nice little rubber gasket that you can buy. You can typically buy these in sheets or even big rolls depending on the store that you go to, and you just cut it to size. And that's what we used here to actually mount it basically to the exterior of this window here, where it's kind of a small frame. Actually, only about half of the gang box is actually attached to this window frame here. But we've got this nice big rubber seal that goes across the back of it that, one, prevents where we're actually mounting the thing to actually scratching it, so you don't have the metal rubbing on metal, rubbing off the paint, but it creates this nice rubber gasket area in between the back of the gang box and the window that it's attached to. So this is what we would typically call a good installation, where you're not really going to run into any potential problems. All of the ingress points for water are going to be sealed. Of course, this big exterior part is normally covered with the intercom, as are these six holes. So really nothing to worry about from the front aspect of it. That's covered from the factory with your gasket. And the rear portion of the gang box is really what you want to focus on when you're dealing with an installation. Oh, we have another comment. Just to be picky, and if there's no grounding wire, how long will that intercom last? That's a very good point. That's a very good point. Typically, we do always recommend, when somebody's going to be installing one of our intercoms, basically, or really any type of equipment that'll be interacted with physically, say a call button, an outdoor intercom, even a strobe in some senses, should be connected to earth ground, just to prevent any static shock from people going through the board and potentially damaging it. We do take protections with the way that we design the enclosure and the boards themselves to take little to no damage from an electrostatic shock. We've had a lot of fun with a shock testing tool. Never really knew that one of those things existed until I started working at CyberData, but that's the kind of fun thing that you get. But we do recommend that all of our equipment is connected to earth ground when it's installed, especially anything that people are going to be physically interfacing with, meaning physically touching, where they can do that electrostatic discharge, should be connected to earth ground, just to prevent any issues. We designed for it, so it shouldn't be a problem, but you should go that extra mile and just protect it anyway. So let's talk about some horror stories. Of course, we get some people that do some good installations, sometimes not. And this one here on the left is a very key example. This is actually a screenshot from a video, and this is the same intercom that we have here, where unfortunately they mounted the intercom to a brick wall and didn't take any precautions to seal the nice little grout lines between all the nice parts of brick. You can kind of see it in our middle image here to just see the sheer difference in depth between the brick face and the grout in between, which left a really nice channel for water to just run right down through here. And they took a great video of this. Of course, I didn't want to show it in here, but when they went and actually removed the intercom from the mounting point there, the entire gang box was full of water. And water poured out to the point that when they took out one of the screws, they took out the bottom right screw here. They had the top 3 screws sealing it. There was just a nice steady stream of water as the thing emptied and came back to ambient pressure. So our gasket really does work, but it's only so good as it covers the front half. The back half you have to protect. So key points of failure for this first particular installation for these 2 pictures here are these 3 mounting screws that were not properly sealed. So while this wasn't our fault area, this is a potential area for water to come in. And a simple solution would have just been a nice little bead of caulk around the top of it, just a nice big old glob like you put on, like a kid would put on their toothbrush. They haven't learned, little like a Skittle for doing toothpaste on their toothbrush. You just do a big old glob on that, seal that thing up, and you're good to go. No water's going to get in there. And they should have done the same thing. One over the actual back of the gang box, doing a nice good seal around that to prevent it, but also a nice seal around the conduit entry hole here to prevent any water from actually condensing in the conduit and then running back down through. I can tell you from experience, we've had that occur as well. So there's a couple points of failure that led to this wonderful, yucky mess that we get on the inside here. And unfortunately, as you can likely assume from this damage to the circuit board, this one was not going to be protected by our warranty, and unfortunately that one was damaged to improper installation. So these are just some good images that you can see here of a problem. And then on our right-hand side, you can see another installation where they did a pretty good job actually sealing the unit to, frankly, a pretty tough surface to actually install this to. It's hard to tell from this picture, but some other pictures we got from this install is it's not, say, a flat brick surface. It's kind of more of a rougher stone surface. It's still kind of like a bigger brick, but it's more of like a rougher stone surface. And this is actually a really good job of caulking that goes all the way around the exterior of the gang box. So that part of the installation was really good. There's no problems with that. But you'll notice that, of course, the holes that they actually used to mount the gang box to that surface weren't properly sealed. And you can see a little bit of calcification on the top screw hole here, where a little bit of calcium is kind of collected on there, and that's just from the hard water just kind of collecting and drying there. And unfortunately, this big conduit entry hole is completely unsealed. And we've had this happen a lot, where we've had different intercoms, especially for outdoor locations, where they'll run, a regular conduit pipe over there to really protect all their cables and have the conduit come out right where they install the intercom. And the thing when you're dealing with big metal pipes like that is they get real cold sometimes, and that not even say humid weather. It can be, say, 30-40% humidity in an area. Well, when that water goes, that water vapor goes up that nice long cold tube, the water will collect on the exterior of that conduit pipe. And as soon as that water gets big enough for gravity to take hold, it will pull that drop down. And that drop only has one place to go, and that's right into the back of the gang box of the intercom. I couldn't tell you how many times we've had installations where they do their due diligence, they seal the sides, they seal all the entry holes, but they leave that conduit hole open because, we don't need to seal that, it's no big deal. And it lasts for a while. Usually, unfortunately, it sucks. It's usually right around 2 years when that problem will start to occur. But after that installation, over time, that water just starts to slowly condense and collect in the back of the gang box for that intercom and kills the intercom. And it sucks. It's always usually about 2 years, sometimes just under. Typically, our stuff has a 2-year warranty, a great reason to go for that. That full, get that extra extended warranty to ensure that your stuff will get protected. But There's a lot of possibilities for potential water ingress. So really taking that extra due diligence, just spending that little bit of time to protect all those potential holes for that water to get through is super duper important when you're dealing with an intercom. These can be some of the more difficult installs just because of all the points that you want to seal when you're dealing with that installation. And as a counterpoint, the IP66 horn really isn't anywhere near as difficult because, frankly, the IP66 horn should arrive fully intact and fully sealed from the factory. And when I say fully sealed, of course, I'm not talking about the big pigtail that we have shown here, but the actual body of the IP66 horn should be factory tight. Of course, when you're dealing with anything that has gone through shipping, it's been sitting in the back of a FedEx truck or a UPS truck, and it kind of bounces around in there, you'd be surprised. Screws can actually come loose. That's why when most people that drive race cars get that race car to wherever they're taking it, they check every single bolt because things get loose when they move around. And as things kind of bounce around in a car, screws can work themselves loose more than you would expect. So really, when you get one of these things, you want to make sure that all screws and bolts are going to be tight. There's 8 screws that go around the front of the horn, and that holds the front of the horn to the back of the body. You don't need to say pull those out and check them. Just verify that everything's nice and tight. And then there's 2 bolts on the side of the horn that actually secure the big mounting bracket on there, and you want to ensure that those are tight. We don't really recommend removing those to take the clamp off to actually go and mount the bracket to whatever surface that you're mounting it to, but it's your horn and you can do with it as you please. Just if you do, make sure that everything is sealed and properly back in place. Those mounting brackets underneath have kind of a grommet or O-ring, and it's a keyed, so it should stay in place. And we do actually put some adhesive on there to prevent it from getting moved. But if that bolt does come out, really do take that extra second just to make sure that the grommet is properly mounted in place, and it's got a little keyhole on it just to make sure that the key is in the hole and the grommet's not going to move around, just to make sure that part's properly in place. And if you do that, basically the IP66 horn is going to be secure. But the other pain point, the other place where you can run into precautions is going to be what we call our pigtail. And that's where you make the connection from that Cat5 or that Cat6 cable into the actual horn itself. After you mount it, as we say, all you got to do is run a Cat5, Cat6 cable to it, connect it, and you're done. Well, this is where you actually connect it. And this is kind of a common connector that you'll see for anything that's going to be IP66 rated. And you're dealing with any types of cables that frankly can't be IP66 rated. You have to have some kind of an enclosure. So basically each side of the system works in parts, where you've got your big cap over here that is basically a captive cap on this end because it's attached to this cable here, so it's not going to be able to come off. Then you've got this nice little plastic piece here that fits inside these fins. And once this cable comes through, this little plastic piece, this rubber gasket, should be stuck in these fins, and then it is stuck into the cap here and screwed together. And as the screw threads come together, it actually pushes on a little hole that you can't really see pictured here. It pushes all these fins down on that little rubber grommet seal and really just kind of cinches everything down onto that Cat5 or Cat6 cable to form that really perfect seal. And that basically seals from the outside of the cable to the cable itself. So that way no water can get in that point. But a nice little extra bit of protection is just the O-ring that then seals this part of the connection to that part of the connection. So in the middle, because we're dealing with a regular smaller Cat5 or Cat6 cable that's actually internal to the horn that plugs into the circuit board in the horn, has to connect to kind of an intermediary switch here. And that's where these O-rings come in. These O-rings go on the inside of this connector to just go and make sure that this side is sealed and this side is sealed. So that way no water can get into this section here. And then finally, for what we call the customer side, this side is called the factory side, basically the left side. Anything closest to the horn is what we call the factory side. This should come sealed as you get it. You should not need to go and open this side up. As long as we're doing our job in the factory, that thing should be sealed. But it's always good to take your due diligence and just make sure that that thing is good and tight, because things move around in shipping. But the right-hand side is what we call the customer side. And this is the part that customers are responsible for. So as you're going and you're wiring this thing up, your Cat5 or Cat6 cable comes through this part of the hole, and then you basically just, with this nice little slit on your rubber grommet here, that you basically just kind of slip that over the Cat5 or Cat6 cable, and that gets inserted here. What I found as I was assembling these for the trade show and just kind of doing some basic testing, I find that it's actually easier to run the cable through here and then stick the rubber grommet on and then pull it back through. Instead of having to push this guy through these fins, it's easier to just pull it into the fins and then tighten the fins down on it. But as long as you get this in here, you're good to go. And it uses the exact same action when you screw this down. It pushes down on all the fins on that rubber grommet and really seals everything together. And then finally, the pièce de résistance, you've got that nice little O-ring that goes in here that just makes sure the switch is all nice and factory sealed, good to go. So with one of these, if they're good, installed properly, you won't have any problem with IP rating. These things are all slotted, so that way you can get in there with a wrench, but you're dealing with plastic pieces, so we really don't recommend getting in there and tightening down with a wrench because it's plastic. It's really easy to break. So we do really recommend at least getting in there and making sure it's good and hand tight. You're not going to hurt anything by screwing it in hand tight, unless you're, old 80s Arnold Schwarzenegger. He shouldn't do that. He should have somebody else do it. But as long as you're not somebody like that, you're not really going to run into any issues during that kind of pigtail installation. So that's kind of the pain points and stuff that you want to watch out for when you're dealing with one of these installations. So let's talk a little bit more about, okay, you missed one of those steps. What could happen? So on our left-hand side here, because the O-rings weren't in place on this particular kind of intermediary switch, basically what goes in between the pigtail, this little middle piece here, because those O-rings weren't in place, a little bit of water was able to collect on the inside of the switch here, and you can see that these pins are actually starting to rust, where you can see this particular pin right here is really starting to get rusty. And that's just because that's typically where the power will flow through the unit. So that's, a real point of failure there. And where this can manifest, it can manifest in a couple different ways when you get this type of a damage. Most commonly, we see that the thing powers up, it'll still get power, but it doesn't supply any data. But sometimes the thing just ends up dying and you can't get any power, you can't get any data to it. And unfortunately at this point, when it gets to this, it really kind of needs to come back to the factory and we need to be able to handle that for you. That's where a typical warranty service would be involved. And basically all it is on our end, we just replace this intermediary piece that goes between the customer Cat5 and the factory Cat5. We just replace that and we ship the unit back to you and no problem whatsoever. However, there is one other point that we discussed that can be a real pain point during an installation, and that's the rubber grommet that goes around the bolts that actually secure the giant bracket to the exterior of the horn. And if that grommet isn't put back in place or the keyhole isn't matched so it fits in there nicely, water can get in there. And unfortunately what happens is when you get water and electricity together, that does the thing called electrolysis. And what that does is when electricity is supplied to water, it breaks down the water into its two natural elements, oxygen and H2O, which can lead to explosives. Thankfully not for our products because they're not explosion proof. So you really don't have to worry about that part of it. But where it does come in is that will separate, of course, the water and the oxygen and the hydrogen into their respective elements. But all that other stuff that's in the water also gets condensed in there and likes to collect on metal. So you've got a really nice bracket here that actually holds the bolt as you screw the bolt in. This thing has just absolutely gotten covered in rust and calcium from that water that it collected on there and totally ruined it. You can see a nice little bead of rust that has just kind of run down the whole horn here. So unfortunately, due to this and the way that this thing got installed, the whole thing filled with water and just totally ruined the unit. So unfortunately, this is another case of the unit that had to go to our graveyard and got harvested for parts. So things can happen if you don't do your due diligence when you're installing these things and really maintaining that particular IP rating. So those gaskets are just oh so important. Really make sure that they're properly in place as you're going and mounting these different horns. So Let's talk about IP ratings in general. IP ratings are extremely important when you're going to be basically dealing with any type of equipment. I don't think personally I would want to buy any electrical switches or electrical outlets that aren't IP 22 rated. I don't want something that's say IP rated 0 that I can stick my hand into. So IP ratings are super duper important when you're dealing with both indoor and outdoor equipment, but more so with outdoor, just because that's where you're dealing with the more fine nuances of water protection and dust protection. Um, IP rating is something that we encounter all the time. You're always interacting with stuff that's IP rated. Just because it's got a low IP rating, say like a regular electrical outlet, doesn't mean that they didn't take the time and the precautions to design something for that particular protection in mind. But with that said, just because they've taken the time and they've run it through all those tests, IP rating doesn't mean that it's a guarantee that the thing won't get damaged due to the elements. Just because it's got an IP rating, oh boy, it's IP66 rated, I'm just going to slap it on a cinder block wall and not protect the back of the gang box. Well, unfortunately, as long as you go through and you take all the proper protections and you protect the device and that IP rating, that thing's going to last a long time. But if you just rely on that IP rating, oh, it's IP66 rated, it doesn't matter where I install it, you're going to run into problems. So you really want to take precautions when you're installing something to prevent any points of water ingress or any potential issues that can occur during that potential outdoor usage. And really, to that extent, sealing just the outside of the exterior of any of your equipment isn't always enough, especially when you're dealing with intercoms. When you're dealing with an IP66 horn, please don't open it. You don't need to. It's all sealed from the factory. Just make sure that everything's tight, and then don't poke your head in there. You can, it's your equipment, but if you do that, do make sure that everything is sealed properly. You don't need to seal the inside. We're doing our due diligence, so you don't have to. But with your intercoms, really do make sure to seal not only the exterior of the unit, but seal the interior as well. All those places where you use screws to actually mount the gang box, all of that needs to get sealed, as well as any potential conduit holes that you're using to route cable through. Basically, anywhere where something can go out from the intercom box should be sealed so nothing can come in, and vice versa. If something can come in, nothing should be able to come out. So let's talk about a couple terms as we kind of round things up today. IP rating is just a rating system that defines dust and water protection levels. If you don't know what that means, by the end of this video, you must have had your sound off. NEMA rating builds on the IP rating and goes even further beyond. And that's a rating system that doesn't just define dust and water protection, but also corrosion protection. Of course, it doesn't mean that, oh, I can go dump this thing at, a thing of hydrofluoric acid or something like that. It's not acid proof, but it's corrosion resistant, which just means that it takes a little bit of time before the acid eats away at it. Electrolysis is another term that we used, and that's just the breakdown of water via electricity. There's a lot smarter people than me that do better videos to explain that on YouTube, so go watch those, or go ask your high school science teacher. They often do demonstrations with electrolysis for chemistry students. And then finally, caulking is just a waterproof sealant. It's typically some type of silicone.
Thank you for watching this edition of CyberSchool. If you have any questions, please get in contact with our sales department. They are available by email at sales@cyberdata.net or by phone at 831-373-2601 extension 334. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe for more content like this from CyberData.